sure that's why a lot of you are here to hear Father Massaro give this incredible talk that I'm sure it will be. There's a pressing need for the goals of the Joan and Ralph Lane Center for Catholic Studies and Social Thought to be achieved. The Lane Center is devoted to research, education, and the promotion of Catholic intellectual heritage, with a particular focus on the social teachings of the Catholic tradition. It is sponsored by the St. Ignatius Institute as well, and has had a lot of talk going on this semester, and is sure to be very, very successful next year. We've heard the ideas this semester of Jerome P. Daggett on producing Catholic social thought, interpreting the supply and demand sides of the equation. Peter Henriot came and gave an excellent talk on Catholic social thought and African public policy. Susan A. Ross, with her talk entitled, Can God Be a Bride? Women in the Catholic Church. And the last one that was incredibly powerful by Jeanette Rodriguez on race and class in the church and society. Today, we meet with Tom Massaro, who will talk about globalization, and economic justice. Thomas Massaro is an associate professor of moral theology at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He teaches courses in Catholic social ethics and lectures frequently on topics involving the church and social justice. His research addresses the moral evaluation of American policies regarding domestic and international issues, including foreign policy, anti-poverty efforts, and globalization. He is the author of many articles and 4 books, including Catholic Social Teaching and United States Welfare Report, Living Justice, Catholic Social Teaching in Action, which I have skimmed and plan to read soon, American Catholic Social Teaching, and Catholic Perspectives on Peace and War. In a practical application of Catholic studies, Father Massaro speaks to us today on globalization and economic justice. Please join me in welcoming Father Tom Massaro.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm very excited to be here, and especially to be in this lecture series on Catholic social concerns. I'm familiar with the work, and in some cases the personality of some of the speakers who've been preceded me, and it's an honor to be in that same vein. I suspect that other speakers in this series have attempted to begin their talk by situating their topic in the tradition of the Second Vatican Council. The Council ended almost 40 years ago. Its signature document, and the very last one that it released on December 7th of 1965, is the famous document called Gaudium et Spes, and the English subtitle is The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. And that document, I would say, is just the keystone of post-conciliar Catholic social teaching over the last 40 years. One of the things that that document says about our church's social teaching is that we must be, as Christians, we are called to be aware of the signs of the times. And it quotes Matthew's Gospel and says that we are called to read the signs of the times and through the eyes of faith to apply that to the world, to try to make sense of things that are happening in the world and interpret those signs of the times in the light of the gospel. Well, I would contend that one of the premier signs of the times today is the topic of globalization, a word that is indeed hard to pronounce. It's hard to get a fix on it, but I think it's very important that we work today over the next hour or so trying to get a good understanding of globalization. I'll try to make it as vivid as possible, not too abstract, and then try to talk about what the church has said so far and hopefully do a little bit of analysis and evaluation of what the church might be doing in the future with regard to teaching around the topic of globalization. You can follow my talk by the one-page handout that was available in the back. If you happen not to have one, maybe just raise your hand. Someone can bring you one. I'll bounce through that 3-part outline. I may add a few points along the way. And I promise I'll keep my remarks to about 50 minutes, and then we'll have 25 or 30 minutes for questions. I'm always eager to hear what interests, what topics are in the minds of people who themselves are probably facing globalization first thing to say about globalization is that it's a heavily contested term. Everyone has a slightly different definition of globalization, a slightly different emphasis or understanding of what it means for us today. There's a growing body of literature on globalization, most of it economic, but although some of it more philosophical and even theological. We'll be talking about some of that today. I live near a bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and recently there's an entire new section of that bookstore. It's wedged between the U.S. history and politics and government. And that section, with its own title, is Globalization. So if you have your own section in the bookstore, you know it's an important topic. Among the more popular books in that section of the bookstore, let me mention three authors who talked about globalization and give us at least partial definitions. The first one I want to mention is one of the most astute observers of globalization, a man named David Held. And Held focuses on space, the spatial transformation that globalization consists of. In other words, things are closer. Our world is more likely to witness interregional, even intercontinental flows of goods, of people, of investments across borders. And so Held emphasizes that the boundaries that used to separate people, borders, are now less important. Boundaries are more porous now than they ever were before. One of my favorite authors on globalization, a man whose book I use in a course, is William Greider, and he's a journalist. You can read his column in Nation magazine, among other places. He wrote a book a few years ago called One World, Ready or Not. And the title of that book really does give you an angle on what he says about globalization. Similar to David Held, William Greider says that the world is increasingly one place, but not just objectively, that we can reach other people quicker. Subjectively, our entire consciousness, William Greider says, has changed. People feel closer. He's probably reaching back to something that Immanuel Kant said over 200 years ago. In his ethical theory, Kant said, we are now indisputably side by side. All people share a common community because all people are linked in many ways that were impossible in previous generations. Airplane travel, technological improvements of communications and transportation, for example. Maybe the best summary of William Greider's insight is, isn't it a commercial? We're all connected. Right, it's a jingle for some company. We're all connected now in ways that are indisputable and far surpassing previous generations. A third gentleman I'd like to quote in his definition of globalization is the famous New York Times foreign affairs columnist, Thomas Friedman. Now, I don't always agree with Thomas Friedman's take on the Middle East, on Iraq, and other things. He's pretty happy that we're in Iraq. But I will quote him on this. Several years ago, Friedman published a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and a lot of people are nodding their heads. Yes, it's a famous book. It's probably sold more copies than any other book on the topic of globalization. And it's a fascinating read. It's very pro-business, and for those of you who are extremely pro-business, you're probably very happy with the book. There are moments, though, of ethics, of pulling back from the pro-business agenda and talking about the ethics of globalization. And towards the end of the book, Friedman has this very witty saying in which he says, after all these hundreds of pages, how do I define globalization? Well, here's my definition. Globalization is everything and its opposite.